Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of the Wagner Students for Criminal Justice Reform podcast. I'm your host, Thurston Powers, and with me today is Leland Radovcic, the president of the Barrage Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Thank you for joining us again, Leland, and I'm still struggling with that last name. I apologize.
That's all right. Thank you for having me again.
Now, when we last had you on the show, that was right before the election. You were telling us about some of the ballot initiatives. So what happened?
So, uh, as far as cannabis is concerned, we had a really, really big victory. 8 of the 9 states that were set to legalize in some sort of fashion legalized. I think the only one that didn't was Arizona, which lost by not a huge margin. I think it was like maybe 6 points, 7 points, something like that.
Hmm.
But California passed, Maine passed, Massachusetts, and then kind of like what was the most surprising was that medical passed in a lot of these really red states like Montana, North Dakota, Florida, and Arkansas. Yeah, Arkansas.
Now, that does make a little bit of sense to me because I think that a lot of the messaging on sort of especially medical marijuana has changed in terms of this idea of sort of like being like a compassionate Christian and understanding that there are children who are dealing with epilepsy who are basically having their minds destroyed without some of these interventions.
Yeah,
So,
I think what's very interesting is that you have what can be a really, I don't want to call it an easy sell, but I mean when you bring somebody like a soldier or a child up in front of somebody you would normally consider conservative and not maybe necessarily for cannabis, or even somebody who's towards the left and who's not into that. It's those are like two really emotional things that bring up a lot of emotion for people. A lot of the things we say we do, especially built around cannabis, is like for the kids. And so when you bring a kid who's got, grand mal seizures, who's having 200 to 300 a day, and who only has another year to live, and you show them that, cannabis helps them, bring down these seizures, these episodes within 15 minutes. In some cases, there's actually a new nasal spray that just came out called Haley's Hope. It's a strain that they use. It's a nasal spray, and it works within 15 seconds.
wow.
And so, I mean, you put this in front of anybody, and they're going to have a really hard time, you know, seeking within themselves, saying, no, this person shouldn't have this medicine.
Now, you bring up the troops, which is another interesting thing. So, I was I remember when we first started to hear about the impacts on post-traumatic stress and pain disorder management. And that was like breaking news like 3 years ago. But now, even without the sort of, unfortunately, it's really hard to research Schedule 1 substances.
Mhm.
But there's like, I don't know. I think we're going to see some interesting. I'm hoping in the future, some interesting research on sort of the impact of marijuana, or specifically like THC on post-traumatic stress.
I would agree. One of the biggest things is that marijuana, cannabis is exceptional when it comes to Schedule 1 substances, in that there was only one organization that had a license to grow for study, and that was the NIH, the National Institute of Health, or actually the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA. And that recently just got lifted. And so now other organizations can apply for licenses to grow cannabis. And it's not like that for any other Schedule 1 substances. You have all sorts of people that are creating, methamphetamines, cocaine, all of these, psychedelic substances. But cannabis was very, very tight, and they had this monopoly around it. So I think that's going to, by virtue, open up more avenues to research, and I feel like I don't know, the troops is like one of our last. I don't know, the way we treat them is really really shitty as far as I'm concerned, and
Mhm.
I think public consensus is coming around to medical cannabis specifically, and if you have people saying support the troops, are you not gonna allow them this avenue of of healing or of relief?
And I mean, most of the evidence is like sort of anecdotal so far, but I mean, that to me is all the more reason to research, because like if there are side effects or complications, we need to know that too. So
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. And that's one of the shitty things is that there has been some research. It hasn't been robust, obviously, and it's a little old now at this point. And so it's time to, I think, really study, just like we do anything else. But
yeah,
we can't necessarily study it like we do other things because cannabis has a lot of components, has a lot of chemical components in it, and we have this system of thinking where we have to go through the FDA, right? Which is why they say there's no medical use of it. It's got no medical use. It's because it has no medical use by our own standard of going through the FDA process of doing a drug. And to do the FDA process, you have to have this single, what do I call it? It's like just kind of like a single if you were studying cannabis, you can't study THC, THCA, CBD, CBC all together. You have to
yeah,
choose one of them and then put that through the ringer, which it doesn't cannabis doesn't necessarily work like that.
yeah. It's what's the word?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically like a system of different chemicals working on the brain.
Yeah, they call it the entourage effect.
Yes, yeah. That's what I was trying to remember. Um, so, hopefully, I mean, we started out November 7th with 5% of the population living in a state, in like a state where um, marijuana was decriminalized or legalized. And we are now, I think, how much are we at? What percent?
So if you count medical, recreation, and decriminalization, well, actually, if you just count medical and recreational, 59.6% of the population has access to some form of cannabis, some legal form, whether it's medical or adult use recreational.
Wow.
And California was the big one, right? Because
Mhm.
California, in and of itself, has 10% of our total population, and if you look at it globally, they're the sixth largest economy in the world. 35. I don't know. It's 35, 36, somewhere in there, million people living in that state, and yeah. Uh,
Yeah, they may leave, so who knows?
Well, look, I don't blame them necessarily for the sentiment, but I would like them to stick around with us because I do benefit from their tax dollars um, as well, and so I think what a lot of people don't realize is um, the Midwest. There are some sentiments where it's like, yeah, go do it, but they don't realize California, New York, New Jersey, these states are paying in a lot more money to the federal government than they're getting out, and so to lose something like California, Washington, Oregon to their own new Cascadia, um, then it would not be good for the total population.
But you have to admit, it is pretty funny that the states that have railed against sort of the federalist structure of the United States are the ones wishing that states had more autonomy now. That's a little funny.
It's growing pains, I guess.
Um, so yeah, that sort of yeah. In terms of the states' rights things, how are you feeling about the Jeff Sessions pick for
Uh,
AG?
so I've had some really good discussions about this, and
Yeah.
I may be coming from a position of privilege when I say this and that I don't think cannabis is going anywhere. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, 60% of the population has some access to cannabis. It would be a nightmare for the federal government to come in and try and uh, really go through and start knocking down shops one by one. It would be a massive waste of money. Uh, and on top of that, you have now these states like Colorado and Washington and Oregon who have now tasted. I mean, they've like, Colorado made almost $1 billion last year in tax revenue. And I don't think that the state is going to be so willing to give that up. And I couldn't point out to a historical time that this has happened, but I could foresee the states suing the federal government, or kind of giving a big pushback against the federal government for now this whole tax revenue that the federal government is going to try and take away. I think as consumers will be okay, no matter what. I think the big danger, if they do start doing it, is going to be on the legal end. It's going to be business owners that are going to be the big kind of sufferers, because we're just going to go back to gray market, right? We're going to go back to gray and black market. And I also, what was the other? I, you know, I don't see it as something feasible. I think it might come to a standstill, right? I think that states might feel kind of leery against making a move. And I think it'll be maybe a tougher challenge now for the movement, but I don't see it going anywhere. And on the flip side, I see it as being that much more important for the cannabis community to then get and get behind, our LGBTQ communities, our indigenous communities, our immigrant communities, to make sure that they're the ones that are being protected, because those are the ones that I see are in a direct danger, of like rapid legislation kind of happening that's going to really affect them. So I think cannabis is in a good place right now.
Yeah. So, for those who are unaware, Jeff Sessions has sort of a history of not being fond of marijuana users. And he and Trump have both come out very strong against sanctuary cities. And this kind of conflicts with what the conservative wing of the GOP has sort of stood for, which is, well, it's their state, let them do what they want. So,
Yeah,
yeah, it,
I,
yeah,
I think that'll be the other thing too, is that I see what's becoming a stronger sentiment is a states' rights sentiment, and I feel like the majority of people are going to be like, look, this if the states have voted on it, the states have voted on it. Like, it's who are we to then, counterimpose these rules? I think it's going to be important. I mean, we have to. I don't think a federal legalization is going to happen when we have somebody with Jeff Sessions in. But and which kind of stinks for me, because I see it's like you're creating these very different economies in each of these states, whereas I think you kind of need this, national uh, legalization to happen, which definitely won't happen under Sessions. But I may be wrong.
mm,
It's unfortunately it's a lot of speculation right now. Nobody's in office yet, but these are not good people for the movement, as far as we can see. So
so that kind of, yeah, leads to the next thing, which is, has there been any exit polling or research into sort of the thoughts and motivations that went to voters who voted for legalization? Because I'm a little confused. I mean, Trump ran on a tough on crime, empower the police, stop and frisk, law and order platform. And yet, it seems like many of the people who voted for more law also voted for decriminalization.
yeah, I think a lot of the rhetoric is now starting to become, if the old prohibition rhetoric was a knitted sweater, we've I think we've pulled on the right string, and it's starting to come undone. And even people who were very tough on crime have to see that, you know, people getting arrested for cannabis is doing nothing for crime whatsoever. And so I think and this is also going to be a challenge for the drug policy movement going forward when we start tackling stigma of heroin and cocaine and methamphetamines. People have now seeing, oh, marijuana is less dangerous than alcohol. It's harmless. So I think that's kind of the general sentiment of it.
Well, I'm not sure that I would agree that it's harmless. I think there are harms, but I
Yeah,
don't think that they are dr- dramatically overinflated. Like,
yeah, I mean, I would agree with you, but that's the general sentiment that, if you were to walk up to somebody on the street corner and you ask them about cannabis, chances are the first thing that's going to say out of their mouth, oh, it's not as dangerous as alcohol, it's harmless, which of course I would, everything has a level of harm, which is why I want to decriminalize and legalize all drugs, to mitigate those harms of, of such.
yeah, that's the sort of perspective where it's like the cost of policing on these sorts of behaviors is greater than the harm that they cause to the individual and their community.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
it's it's a cost benefit analysis, and I think people have run that in their heads for cannabis, and they said, this is silly. Um, we need to be policing other things.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Um, it does seem though that like we every time we start to like ease up on prohibition in one area, we seem to start trying to find ways to criminalize new things.
Oh man, well, see, that's what I mean. That's been kind of. I had a really good conversation with somebody in the communications department at Drug Policy Alliance. He's a communication strategist, and we were talking about sort of the dangers of the cannabis movement right now. And one of them is that because people are seeing this as harmless, we're seeing a harder crackdown on things like heroin and fentanyl. So, like in New York, one of my favorite attorneys, Preet Bharara, who put away, was it Sheldon Silver and the other man, I can't remember his name, who were the House majority and minority leaders in our state Senate. He put them away for corruption, but now he's kind of turning into now a zealot for putting people in jail for life if they've sold somebody a bag of heroin and that person overdoses, which is we're now regressing in these other areas. And I think some of that, I don't want to say all of it has to do with the cannabis movement, but some of it has to do with saying, oh, this is harmless. And by putting this on a harmless tier, we've now separated it and we're kind of we're then conflating by just by virtue of it the dangers of these other drugs, and now we're unfortunately getting hard on heroin again. Like you can't throw somebody in jail for life for selling somebody heroin and they overdose. I mean that does nothing for anybody anywhere, but it's I mean that's going to be one of the
We
big
learned
fights.
that in the 80s. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's going to be, I think, one of the big things coming forward is how can we shift the cannabis movement, which is happening, into now focusing on these other on these other drugs, the ones that people would normally consider quote unquote hard drugs.
So is that sort of where students responsible drug policy are starting to shift their focus?
Right now, the big focus is kind of racial justice
Mm.
and criminal justice. I think I don't want to speak for my movement, but from what I've seen, some people are growing a little cynical of the cannabis movement. And so you will see a lot more being done and talked about as far as other drugs, as far as messaging, kind of branding, even. And I think that it will take shape. But right now, everybody's still kind of in this um, post election haze and not really sure of where things are going and trying to figure things out.
Yeah. So now Massachusetts and Maine legalized, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So now that New York City has been shown up, do you think that they're gonna move anytime soon?
So I want them to. Our biggest opponent is Cuomo. Obviously, it's always been our biggest opponent, and it will be until he gets out of office. But we have a really rare opportunity where you have somewhere like Massachusetts who has a big economy, and they have the Boston economy. And not for nothing, it's very easy to get to Boston from New York. And cannabis is a tourist attraction, and so people are going to want to leave to go to Boston and go get high. Whether you can do it in public is legal or not, people don't care. They're going to go buy, edible products. They're going to go take a trip out to Boston, to Cambridge, and all these places, and you're going to see money leaving New York. And not only that, you're going to have people driving over the Massachusetts border and bringing back cannabis very easily, and there's not going to be any good way for our state police to take care of it. Excuse me. So I think there's a really good opportunity here to put a lot of pressure and leverage on our state assembly and our state senate. Do I see it happening this year? I want it to, but I think it'll be more of a 2-year thing. The projections used to be 4 or 5 years, but now that Maine and Mass legalized, people are saying like 2, 3 at most. So it's going to happen, and I want to make it happen. So.
Well, that sounds like you guys have got like a 1-2 year plan, and I don't know. I wish you guys luck. I mean, yeah, I think that there's going to be a lot more movement in the Northeast now that there's that sort of wall has been broken.
Yeah, it's unfortunately New York kind of falls behind to Boston sometimes with things. They fell behind with gay marriage, and we're falling behind with cannabis. And what my hope is, because there's already been a bill that's been out for a while, is that because of Massachusetts put in some really, really strong social, kind of criminal justice reforms in there, that's what I'm hoping to make sure that we apply enough pressure that happens, because we can't legalize New York and allow people to stay in jail or be barred out of, opening a business because they've had a previous marijuana offense.
Absolutely.
So that's what people are really holding Massachusetts and California, those bills of a really high regard for those reasons, that we're kind of looking back, we're reaching back and helping those communities that we did a ton of harm from this, from this drug. Exactly.
Yeah. Economic inclusion is going to be sort of a topic that we touch on over the next 2 months. It's definitely, I mean, it's like we punish people for engaging in a black market by telling them that they cannot participate in the main market. and then we get surprised when they go back to working in the black market.
Exactly. I mean, that was one of the big conversations of, all right, so we're going to legalize, but now you are taking away jobs from people who were selling and who were very good business people and good at doing what they were doing. And so how do we bridge that gap of, all right, we're making this new thing, but we can't bar all these same people out of it, or else we haven't moved forward. If anything, we've just allowed, white men and and rising women to profit off this, profit off the very same system. It just would be too cyclical. And what we've seen in California is that already charges are being dropped. People have been released from prison. So it's happening very fast already. Even to, a lot of the opponents are like, oh, it's just this, it's a sheep's and wolf clothing. But you can't tell me that when charges have been dropped, people have been released within the first 2 weeks of it being implemented. Like, you just can't tell me that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us again, and hopefully we can catch up again soon.
Yes, thank you for having me.
And to the audience, thank you for joining us. If you like what you heard, please subscribe.